Chapter 1. The Invitation to Ashwood Manor. The rain pattered softly against the windows of Miss Marple's cottage in St. Mary Mead, a gentle rhythm that matched the ticking of the mantel clock. She sat by the fire, her knitting needles clicking, in time when the postman's knock broke the evening's calm. A single letter lay on the mat, its envelope crisp but singed at one corner, as if it had narrowly escaped a flame. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and examined the handwriting. It was from Lady Eleanor Ashwood, an old-school friend she hadn't seen in decades. The script was elegant but hurried, the ink smudged in places. She slit the envelope open, and a faint scent of ash wafted out. The letter inside was worse for wear, half of it charred, the edges crumbling at her touch. She read what remained. "My dear Jane, I am in desperate need of your keen mind. Something dreadful has surfaced at Ashwood Manor, a secret I dare not commit fully to paper. A letter, burned yet damning, has stirred old ghosts. Come at once, I beg you. Trust no one, not even—" The rest was ash, the words devoured by fire. Miss Marple's lips pursed. "Curious," she murmured, turning the fragment over. A single phrase, scrawled in a different hand, clung to the unburned margin. "The vow will not be forgotten." She rose, her mind already turning like the gears of a well-oiled clock. Eleanor had always been dramatic, but this was no theatrical flourish. Burned letters, cryptic warnings, and an isolated manner. It was precisely the sort of puzzle that stirred her quiet curiosity. By noon the next day, Miss Marple was on a train rattling towards the moors of Devon, where Ashwood Manor stood like a sentinel against the wild landscape. The carriage was nearly empty, save for a young man in a tweed coat who kept glancing at her over his newspaper. She smiled faintly, noting his restless fingers and the ink stains on his cuff. A journalist, perhaps, or someone with a story to hide. The manor loomed into view as the taxi wound up a gravel drive. Its grey stone towers were half shrouded in mist, ivy clawing at the walls like secrets trying to escape. Miss Marple stepped out, her sensible shoes crunching on the path. The air carried a faint whiff of smoke, though no fire was in sight. The door creaked open before she could knock. Lady Eleanor Ashwood stood there, her silver hair impeccably coiled, her eyes sharp but shadowed. "Jane," she said, clasping Miss Marple's hands. "Thank heaven you've come. I feared you wouldn't." "Nonsense, Eleanor," Miss Marple replied, her voice warm but firm. "When an old friend sends half a letter and half a mystery, I'm hardly likely to stay home knitting." Eleanor's laugh was brittle. "You haven't changed a bit. Come inside. The others are waiting, and I'm afraid—" She hesitated, glancing at the shadowed hall. "I'm afraid one of them knows more than they should." Miss Marple stepped into the foyer, where a grand chandelier cast flickering light on a portrait of a stern-faced Ashwood ancestor. A faint crackle came from the drawing-room, where a fire burned low in the grate. She tilted her head, catching the scent of charred paper again. "Who are the others?" she asked, her tone light, but her eyes keen. Eleanor's voice dropped. "My nephew Rupert, who's been poking into family affairs. Colonel Hargrove, a retired officer with a grudge. A journalist, Mr. Finch, who claims he's writing a book. And Clara, the maid, who's been acting like a frightened mouse. Jane, I found a letter in the fireplace yesterday, burned to almost nothing. It mentioned a vow, a terrible one." Miss Marple's fingers tightened on her handbag. "Then we shall have to find what remains of it," she said softly, "and what it was meant to hide." As Eleanor led her toward the drawing-room, Miss Marple glanced at the fireplace in the hall. A single flake of ash drifted to the floor, glinting like a clue in the firelight. She smiled to herself. The game, as her old friend Sherlock might have said, was afoot. Chapter 2. The Gathering of Suspects. The drawing-room of Ashwood Manor was a study in faded grandeur. Heavy velvet curtains framed tall windows, through which the moors glowered under a slate-grey sky. A fire crackled in the hearth, but its warmth did little to dispel the chill of suspicion that hung over the room. Miss Marple settled into a high-backed chair, her knitting bag at her side, her eyes quietly cataloguing the faces around her. Lady Eleanor stood by the mantel, her posture regal, but her fingers twisting a lace handkerchief. "Everyone," she said, her voice cutting through the murmur of conversation. "This is Miss Jane Marple, an old friend and a woman of remarkable insight. I've asked her here to help us with a troubling matter." 4 pairs of eyes turned to Miss Marple, each carrying its own weight of curiosity, wariness, or defiance. She smiled, her expression as mild as a village spinster's, but her mind was already sorting the players in this unfolding drama. Rupert Ashwood, Eleanor's nephew, lounged against a bookcase, his dark hair tousled and his tie askew. He was handsome in a careless way, but his smirk carried a hint of resentment. "Insight, Aunt Eleanor. What do we need that for? Unless you're planning to unearth more family skeletons." "Mind your tongue, Rupert," Eleanor snapped. "You've been digging enough on your own." Miss Marple noted the flush that crept up Rupert's neck. A young man with debts, perhaps, or ambitions beyond his reach. Colonel Hargrove sat ramrod straight in an armchair, his moustache bristling like a hedge. His weathered face spoke of battlefields, but his eyes darted to the fireplace with a flicker of unease. "No offence, Miss Marple," he said gruffly, "but I don't see why we need an outsider meddling. This is a family matter." "Family matters have a way of spilling over, Colonel," Miss Marple replied, her voice gentle but pointed, "especially when they involve burned letters." The Colonel's jaw tightened, and Miss Marple filed away his reaction for later. Felix Finch, the journalist, leaned forward on the sofa, his tweed coat creased from travel. His sharp green eyes gleamed with the hunger of a man chasing a story. "Burned letters, you say? Fascinating. I'd love to hear more, Miss Marple. Sounds like the sort of thing that could make a book." "Or ruin one," Eleanor said sharply. "Mr. Finch, you were invited to research the Ashwood history, not to pry into our present troubles." Finch raised his hands, all charm. "Just curious, Lady Eleanor. Curiosity's my trade." The final figure was Clara, the maid, who hovered near the door, her apron clutched in trembling hands. She was young, barely 20, with wide eyes that flitted nervously from face to face. When Miss Marple's gaze met hers, Clara flinched and looked away. "Clara, dear," Miss Marple said kindly, "you look as if you've seen a ghost. Or perhaps something in the fireplace?" Clara's breath hitched. I don't know what you mean, miss. I just tend the fires, that's all." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her tone soothing but her eyes sharp. The girl knew something, and fear was keeping it locked inside. Eleanor cleared her throat. "Jane, I must show you what I found yesterday." She crossed to the fireplace and retrieved a small tin box from the mantel. Inside lay a scrap of charred paper, its edges blackened, but a few words still legible. "The vow binds us. Betrayer will pay." Miss Marple leaned forward, her knitting needles still in her lap. "Where was this found, Eleanor?" "In the grate," Eleanor said, her voice low. "It's the second burned letter in as many days. Someone in this house is trying to hide something, or send a message." Rupert snorted. "Sounds like melodrama to me. Probably Clara's penny dreadfuls catching fire." "Leave her alone," Finch said, his tone light but edged. "Unless you've got something to confess, Ashwood." "Enough," Colonel Hargrove barked. "This is no time for squabbling. Lady Eleanor, if there's a threat, we should call the police, not play parlour games with an amateur." Miss Marple's smile didn't waver. "Amateurs, Colonel, often see what professionals overlook. A village like St. Mary Mead teaches one to notice patterns, like the way Ash clings to a certain pair of cuffs." Her eyes flicked to Finch, who quickly tucked his hands into his pockets. The room fell silent, the only sound the crackle of the fire. Eleanor's handkerchief was now a tight knot in her hands. "Jane," she said quietly, "can you help us?" Miss Marple's gaze swept the room, taking in Rupert's defiance, the Colonel's rigidity, Finch's calculated charm, and Clara's trembling silence. "I believe I can," she said, "but I shall need to listen carefully, and watch even more so." As the group dispersed, Miss Marple lingered by the fireplace. She knelt, peering into the grate, where a faint glimmer caught her eye. With a quick glance to ensure she was alone, she plucked a tiny fragment of paper from the ashes. It bore a single word: heirloom. She tucked it into her sleeve, her mind already spinning. The game was indeed afoot, and the ashes were beginning to speak. Chapter 3. The Shadow of the Past. The morning mist clung to Ashwood Manor like a shroud, softening the edges of its grim stone facade. Miss Marple sat in the library, a cup of tea cooling beside her, as Lady Eleanor recounted the Ashwood family's tangled history. The room smelled of old leather and wax, its shelves groaning under the weight of dusty tomes. A portrait of Sir Reginald Ashwood, Eleanor's grandfather, glared down from above the fireplace, his eyes as cold as the moorland wind. "It began 50 years ago," Eleanor said, her voice steady but laced with unease. "My uncle, Theodore Ashwood, was the heir to the estate. He was difficult, obsessed with an heirloom, a sapphire brooch called the Star of Ashwood. Family legend said it carried a curse. Whoever betrayed the family's honour would lose it forever." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. "And did Theodore lose it?" Eleanor nodded. "He vanished one night along with the brooch. The same night, his valet was found dead in the stables, stabbed through the heart. The police called it a robbery gone wrong, but whispers in the village said Theodore had made a vow, a terrible pact, and someone killed to keep it secret." "A vow," Miss Marple murmured, her mind flicking to the charred fragment from the drawing-room, the kind that might be written down, perhaps, and burned to keep it hidden. Eleanor's eyes widened. "You think the letters are connected to that old scandal?" "I think," Miss Marple said, her tone mild, that the past has a way of leaving footprints, even in ashes. Their conversation was interrupted by the creak of the library door. Rupert slouched in, a cigarette dangling from his lips. "Talking about Uncle Theodore again, Aunt Eleanor. You're worse than a broken gramophone." Eleanor's lips thinned. "If you spent less time sneering and more time helping Rupert, we might get to the bottom of this." Rupert flicked ash into a tray, his eyes narrowing. "Maybe there's nothing to find, or maybe you're scared of what's buried, like that brooch you're always banging on about." Miss Marple tilted her head. "You seem awfully interested in the Star of Ashwood, Mr. Ashwood. Have you been looking for it?" Rupert's smirk faltered. "Just family history, Miss Marple. Keeps the old place lively." As he sauntered out, Miss Marple noted the tension in his shoulders. A young man with more than history on his mind, she thought. Debts, perhaps, or a buyer waiting for a certain sapphire. Eleanor sighed. "He's been rummaging through the attic, poking into old trunks. I thought he was just restless, but now, I wonder." Before Miss Marple could reply, Clara appeared at the door, her face pale as milk. "Beg pardon, my lady, but I found something in the West Wing fireplace. I didn't touch it, I swear." Miss Marple rose, her knitting neatly folded. "Show us, Clara." The West Wing was a maze of draughty corridors, its walls lined with faded tapestries. Clara led them to a small sitting room, where a fire had been left to die in the grate. Among the ashes lay another charred fragment of paper, its edges curling, like a dying leaf. Miss Marple knelt, careful not to disturb the ash, and read the faint words. "The blood of the vow." "Blood," Eleanor whispered, clutching her shawl. "Jane, what does it mean?" Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "It means someone is very eager to keep this vow hidden, or to remind us of it." She glanced at Clara, who was trembling. "Clara, dear, who tends this fire?" "I do, miss," Clara stammered, "but I didn't see no letter till now. Honest." "Of course," Miss Marple said kindly, but her mind was elsewhere. The fragment was fresh, the few ink barely faded. Someone had burned it recently, perhaps that very morning. As they returned to the library, Miss Marple caught a glimpse of Colonel Hargrove in the hall, his boots leaving a trail of soot on the rug. He nodded curtly and hurried away, his face unreadable. She tucked the new fragment into her handbag, alongside the word heirloom from the night before. "Eleanor," she said softly, "tell me about the Colonel. He seems burdened." Eleanor hesitated. "He served with my father during the war. There was a falling out, something about a promise broken. He's been a guest here often, but this time he's different, restless." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts spinning like threads in a tapestry. A vow, a brooch, a murder, and now burned letters surfacing like ghosts. The Ashwood past was not just a shadow, it was a storm, and someone in the manor was steering its course. She glanced at the fireplace, where a faint wisp of smoke curled upward. "We must be very careful, Eleanor," she said. "The next letter may not be content to stay in the ashes." Chapter 4. Whispers in the Night. The clock in Ashwood Manor's hall struck midnight, its chimes echoing through the darkened corridors like a warning. Miss Marple lay awake in her guest room, the moonlight casting long shadows across the quilt. She hadn't expected to sleep, not with the puzzle of the charred letters turning in her mind like a kaleidoscope. The fragments she'd collected, heirloom, the blood of the vow, were pieces of a larger picture, but the edges refused to align. A faint creak came from the floorboards outside her door, followed by a muffled whisper. Miss Marple sat up, her senses sharp. Slipping on her dressing gown, she moved silently to the door and pressed her ear against it. The whisper came again, low and urgent, but the words were indistinct. Then a sudden scream tore through the silence, sharp and terrified. She opened the door and stepped into the corridor, where a single gas lamp flickered. The scream had come from the east wing, near the servants' quarters. As she hurried toward the sound, doors creaked open, and bleary-eyed figures emerged. Rupert appeared, his shirt untucked, a scowl on his face. "What the devil's going on now?" he muttered. Colonel Hargrove was next, his dressing gown hastily tied, his moustache quivering with indignation. "Sounds like a banshee. This house is cursed, I tell you." Mr. Finch materialized from the shadows, his notebook already in hand. "A scream at midnight? This just got interesting," he said, his grin almost predatory. Lady Eleanor met them at the end of the hall, her face pale, but composed. "It's Clara," she said. "She's in the drawing-room." They found Clara huddled by the fireplace, her apron twisted in her hands, her eyes wide with fear. The fire had been stoked recently, its flames licking at a fresh log. Miss Marple knelt beside the girl, her voice gentle. "Clara, dear, what happened?" Clara's voice trembled. I was checking the fires like always. I saw someone by the grate, miss, a shadow bending over it. They were burning something. When I called out, they ran, and I screamed." Miss Marple's eyes flicked to the fireplace. A faint curl of smoke rose from the ashes, and there, among the embers, was another charred fragment of paper. She reached for the poker, carefully nudging the scrap onto the hearth. The words were barely legible. "The star will fall." "The star of Ashwood," Eleanor whispered, clutching her shawl. "It's about the brooch." Rupert snorted. Clara's seeing ghosts now. Probably jumped at her own shadow. "Shadows don't burn letters," Finch said, scribbling in his notebook. "This is deliberate. Someone's playing a game." Colonel Hargrove cleared his throat. "Nonsense! The girl's hysterical. Probably dropped a letter in the fire herself and panicked." Clara shook her head fiercely. "I didn't, sir. I swear it." Miss Marple patted Clara's hand, but her attention was on the fragment. The ink was fresh, the paper less brittle than the others. Whoever had burned it had done so in haste. She glanced at the group, noting their positions. Rupert's hands were shoved in his pockets, but a faint smudge of ash marked his cuff. Finch's eyes were too bright, too eager. The colonel stood, stiffly, his gaze fixed on the fire as if it held answers he didn't want to share. "Clara," Miss Marple said softly, "did you see anything else? A glimpse of a coat, perhaps, or a scent?" Clara hesitated, then whispered, "There was a smell, miss, like tobacco, and something sweeter, like perfume." Miss Marple nodded, filing the detail away. Tobacco could point to Rupert or the colonel, both smokers. Perfume, though, was trickier. Eleanor wore lavender, but this sounded different. She rose, addressing the group. Someone in this house is very determined to destroy these letters, or to ensure we find them. I suggest we all return to bed, but keep your doors locked." As the others dispersed, Miss Marple lingered, her eyes on the fireplace. She knelt again, sifting through the ashes with the poker. A tiny glint caught her attention, a sliver of wax, red and melted, as if from a seal. She slipped it into her handkerchief, her mind racing. A sealed letter, burned in haste. The vow was growing clearer, and with it the danger. She returned to her room, pausing at the window to gaze at the moors. The mist had thickened, swallowing the stars, but one word echoed in her thoughts: star. The brooch, the vow, the murder, they were all linked, and the ashes were spelling out a plot she was only beginning to unravel. In the distance, a floorboard creaked again. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Sleep well," she murmured to the shadows. "I shan't." Chapter 5. The Colonel's Confession. The morning sun struggled through the heavy clouds over Ashwood Manor, casting a wan light across the breakfast room. Miss Marple sat at the table, her toast untouched, her eyes quietly observing the strained faces around her. The events of the previous night had left a pall over the house, and the clink of silverware felt like the ticking of a bomb. Colonel Hargrove was the last to arrive, his face etched with fatigue, his boots polished but flecked with ash. He avoided Miss Marple's gaze, focusing instead on his coffee with the intensity of a man facing a firing squad. She noted the faint tremor in his hand. A soldier's nerve, fraying at the edges. "Colonel," Miss Marple said, her voice as gentle as a spring breeze, "you seemed troubled last night. I wonder if there's something you'd like to share. A burden, perhaps, from the past?" The room stilled. Rupert paused mid-bite, his eyes narrowing. Finch leaned forward, his pen hovering over his notebook. Clara, clearing plates, froze by the sideboard. Eleanor's teaspoon clattered against her saucer. Hargrove's moustache twitched. "I don't know what you mean, Miss Marple," he said gruffly. "I'm here as a guest, nothing more." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her smile disarming. "But guests sometimes carry old promises, don't they? Promises that might weigh heavily, like a vow made long ago." The Colonel's cup rattled in its saucer. He set it down, his jaw tight. "You're a sharp one, aren't you?" he before muttered. After a long pause, he leaned back, his voice low. "Fine. I'll tell you something, but it's not what you think. During the war, I served with Eleanor's father, General Ashwood. We were in a tight spot, trapped behind enemy lines. I made a promise to him to protect his family's honour. A vow, if you like." Eleanor's eyes widened. "Father never mentioned this." Hargrove's gaze flickered to her, then away. "He wouldn't. It was personal. After the war, I heard about Theodore's disappearance and the valet's murder. I came to Ashwood to see if I could help. Found nothing but rumours and bad blood. That's all there is to it." Miss Marple tilted her head, her knitting needles clicking softly in her lap. "A vow to protect the family's honour," she mused. "And yet, here we are, with burned letters speaking of betrayal. Curious, isn't it, that you were near the drawing-room last night, Colonel? Clara mentioned tobacco, and I couldn't help but notice your pipe." Hargrove's face reddened. "Are you accusing me, madam?" "Not at all," Miss Marple said, her tone serene. I'm merely observing. In my village, you see, people often say one thing when they mean another, like a man who says he's protecting honour, but might be protecting someone else. The Colonel pushed back his chair, standing abruptly. I've said my piece. I won't be interrogated by a nosy spinster. He stormed out, leaving a heavy silence in his wake. Rupert chuckled, breaking the tension. Well, that was dramatic. Think the old warhorse is hiding something, Miss Marple? Everyone hides something, Mr. Ashwood, she replied, her eyes on the door. The trick is knowing what and why. Finch tapped his pen against his lips. A wartime vow, eh? Sounds like a story. Maybe the Colonel's tied to that missing brooch, or the valet's murder. Eleanor shook her head. He's loyal, Jane. He's been a friend to this family for years. Loyalty, Miss Marple said softly, can be a mask for many things. As the group dispersed, Miss Marple lingered, her gaze falling on the fireplace. No new letters had appeared, but the ashes seemed to whisper all the same. She thought of Hargrove's story. Truthful, perhaps, but incomplete. A vow to protect the family's honour could mean shielding a secret, or even a crime. She slipped into the hall, where Clara was polishing a candelabra with nervous energy. "Clara," Miss Marple said kindly, "you've been very brave. Tell me, did you notice anything else about that figure last night? A sound, perhaps, or a detail you forgot?" Clara bit her lip. "There was a rustle, miss, like silk, and the tobacco. It was strong, like the Colonel's, but mixed with something else. I can't place it." Miss Marple nodded, patting her arm. "You've done well, dear. Keep your eyes open." As Clara scurried off, Miss Marple added the new clue to her mental tapestry. Silk, tobacco, and a vow that bound the past to the present. Hargrove was a piece of the puzzle, but not the whole picture. Someone else was stoking the fires, and she was determined to find them before the next letter turned to ash. Outside, the wind howled across the moors, carrying the scent of smoke. Miss Marple tightened her shawl and smiled. The game was growing warmer. Chapter 6. The Journalist's Discovery. The afternoon light filtered through the library's stained glass windows, casting fractured colours across the oak table where Miss Marple sat, her knitting a pretext for the keen observation of her fellow guests. The air was thick with unspoken accusations. The events of the morning, Colonel Hargrove's outburst, and Clara's trembling clues, lingering like smoke. Miss Marple's mind turned over the fragments of the charred letters, each phrase a thread in a tightening web. Heirloom, the blood of the vow, the star will fall. Felix Finch burst into the room, his tweed coat flapping, his face alight with the thrill of discovery. He clutched a small leather-bound book, its cover worn but intact. "Miss Marple, Lady Eleanor, you'll want to see this," he said, his voice brimming with excitement. "I found it tucked behind a false panel in the library shelves. Pure luck, really." Rupert, sprawled in an armchair, rolled his eyes. "Luck, Finch? Or were you snooping where you don't belong?" Finch ignored him, placing the book on the table. "It's a journal, dated 1875. Belonged to Theodore Ashwood himself. And look here." He flipped to a marked page, revealing a passage in spidery handwriting. "The Star of Ashwood is more than a jewel. It seals the vow, a pact forged in blood. Should it be lost, the betrayer will answer to the ashes." Eleanor gasped, her hand flying to her throat. Theodore wrote this. "It's about the brooch and the vow." Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes scanning the page. "A pact forged in blood," she murmured, "and ashes. This explains why the letters are burned. Someone is honouring or enforcing that vow." Finch's grin widened. "There's more. Another entry mentions a charred vow, hidden where the starlight falls. Sounds like a clue to where the brooch might be." Rupert sat up, his casual demeanour slipping. "Hidden, you say? If that brooch is still in this house, it's worth a fortune." "Or a curse," Eleanor snapped. "Rupert, don't you dare start tearing the place apart." Miss Marple's needles paused. "Mr. Finch, where exactly did you find this journal?" Finch hesitated, his charm faltering. "Like I said, behind a panel. I was exploring the shelves. Research, you know." "Research," Miss Marple echoed, her tone mild but her gaze sharp. "And yet you didn't mention this panel earlier, nor did you show anyone the journal until now. One might wonder if you placed it there yourself." Finch's eyes widened. "Me? Why would I do that?" "Attention," Rupert said, smirking. "You're chasing a headline, Finch. Stirring up. Drama to sell your book." "Enough!" Eleanor said, her voice sharp. "Jane, what do you make of this?" Miss Marple closed the journal, her fingers lingering on the cover. "It's a valuable clue, if genuine. But I find it curious that it appeared so conveniently. Mr. Finch, might I suggest you leave the journal with me for safekeeping?" Finch's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Fine, but I'm not the one burning letters." As he handed over the book, Colonel Hargrove entered, his face grim. He'd been absent since breakfast, and his boots were caked with mud from the moors. "What's this about a journal?" he demanded. Eleanor explained, but Hargrove's eyes were on Finch. "You're stirring up trouble, boy. That vow is best left buried, like the valet's body." Finch shot back. "Or the brooch." Hargrove's hand twitched, as if itching for a weapon. "Watch your tongue, or you'll regret it." Miss Marple cleared her throat, her voice cutting through the tension. "Gentlemen, squabbling won't find the Star of Ashwood. But I wonder, Colonel, where you've been this afternoon. The moors are damp, yet your coat smells faintly of smoke." Hargrove froze. "I was walking, clearing my head." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her smile serene. "Fresh air does wonders." As the group dispersed, Miss Marple tucked the journal into her bag, her mind racing. The journal was a breakthrough, but its timing was suspect. Finch's eagerness, Rupert's greed, Hargrove's secrecy. Each was a piece of the puzzle, but the picture was still blurred. She glanced at the fireplace, where the ashes lay undisturbed. No new letters, but the journal's mention of a charred vow suggested more were coming. She found Clara in the hall, polishing silver with mechanical precision. "Clara, dear," Miss Marple said softly, "have you seen Mr. Finch near the library shelves today?" Clara nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "He was there all morning, miss, poking about. But the journal wasn't the only thing he found." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "Oh?" Clara glanced around, then leaned closer. "I saw him slip something into his pocket. Small, like a bit of paper. He didn't know I was watching." Miss Marple patted her arm. "You're doing splendidly, Clara. Keep watching." As she returned to the library, Miss Marple opened the journal again, her eyes lingering on the phrase where the starlight falls. The star of Ashwood was close. She could feel it, but so was the betrayer, and the ashes were growing restless. Chapter 7. The Maid's Secret. The evening shadows stretched long across Ashwood Manor, pooling in the corners of the servants' hall where Miss Marple found Clara. The young maid was scrubbing a teapot with frantic energy, her knuckles white, her eyes darting to the door as if expecting a spectre. The air carried the faint tang of ash, a reminder of the manor's restless fires. Miss Marple settled onto a wooden bench, her knitting bag at her side, her demeanour as calm as a village pond. "Clara, dear," she said gently, "you've been carrying something heavy, haven't you? Not just teapots, I think." Clara's hands froze, the teapot clattering into the sink. I don't know what you mean, miss," she stammered, but her voice cracked like thin ice. Miss Marple's eyes were kind, but unyielding. "In my village, I've seen girls like you, good girls, caught in someone else's secrets. You saw Mr. Finch with a piece of paper, but there's more, isn't there? Something you've kept to yourself, perhaps about those burned letters." Clara's lip trembled, and she sank onto a stool, her apron twisted in her hands. "Oh, miss, I didn't mean no harm. I was scared, that's all. I found a bit of one of them letters before the one in the West Wing. I hid it, 'cause I thought it'd get me in trouble." Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice soft but firm. "Where is it, Clara? And what did it say?" Clara glanced at the door again, then reached into her apron pocket, pulling out a crumpled, singed scrap of paper. It was smaller than the others, its edges blackened, but a few words were clear. "The air betrayed." Miss Marple's fingers brushed the fragment, her mind racing. "The air," she murmured. "Theodore, perhaps, or someone closer to home. Where did you find this, Clara?" "In the drawing-room grate, miss, 2 days ago," Clara whispered. "I was cleaning, and I saw it before anyone else. I didn't know what to do. The words scared me, and I thought maybe someone would blame me for it." Miss Marple nodded, tucking the fragment into her handkerchief. "You've done the right thing, Clara. But tell me, why were you so frightened? Was it just the words or something else?" Clara's eyes filled with tears. "It's the house, miss. It's like it's watching. And I heard someone talking late at night near the library. A man's voice, angry, saying the vow must hold. I couldn't see who, but it wasn't Mr. Rupert or the Colonel. It sounded different." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, a steady rhythm against the girl's trembling words. "Different how, Clara?" "Posher, like," Clara said. "Like someone who ain't been here long. I thought maybe Mr. Finch, but I ain't sure." Miss Marple patted her hand. "You've been very brave, Clara. Keep this between us for now, and don't be afraid. Secrets have a way of coming to light." As Clara nodded, wiping her eyes, Miss Marple rose, her mind weaving the new clue into the tapestry. The heir betrayed, Theodore Ashwood, the missing heir, or perhaps Rupert, the current one, entangled in the vow's web. And a mysterious voice, not the Colonel's gruff bark or Rupert's drawl. Finch was a possibility, but his charm seemed too calculated for such raw anger. She made her way to the library, where the journal Finch had found lay on the table, its pages heavy with Theodore's cryptic words. She opened it to the passage about the charred vow, rereading the line, "Hidden where the starlight falls. The star of Ashwood was key, but so was the betrayer," and Clara's fragment suggested they were one and the same. A floorboard creaked behind her. Miss Marple turned to find Finch leaning against the doorway, his green eyes glinting in the lamplight. "Burning the midnight oil, Miss Marple," he said, his tone light but probing. "Or just chasing ghosts?" "Ghosts are rarely so talkative, Mr. Finch," she replied, closing the journal. "But I wonder if you've heard any voices lately. Angry ones, perhaps, near the library?" Finch's smile flickered. "Voices? Can't say I have, but I'll keep my ears open. You think our letter-burner's getting chatty?" "Someone is," Miss Marple said, her gaze steady. "And they're not as careful as they think." Finch chuckled, but there was a tightness to it. "You're a sly one, Miss Marple. I almost wish I was the villain, just to see if you'd catch me." As he sauntered off, Miss Marple's smile faded. Finch was clever, but cleverness could hide a multitude of sins. She slipped Clara's fragment into her bag, alongside the others. The vow was tightening its grip, and the air, past or present, was at its heart. Outside, the wind moaned across the moors, carrying the faint scent of smoke. Miss Marple glanced at the fireplace, its embers glowing like eyes. The next move was coming, and she intended to be ready. Chapter 8. The Fire That Speaks. The night was restless at Ashwood Manor, the wind rattling the windows like a warning. Miss Marple sat in her room, the fragments of the charred letters spread before her on the dressing-table. Heirloom, the blood of the vow, the star will fall, the heir betrayed. She had arranged them like a jigsaw, her mind teasing out their meaning. The journal's cryptic phrase, "hidden where the starlight falls," nagged at her, a clue just out of reach. A sudden shout broke her concentration, followed by the sharp crackle of flames. She rose, slipping on her shawl, and hurried into the corridor. The smell of smoke was thick, curling from the direction of the study. Voices overlapped in panic. Eleanor's sharp commands, Rupert's curses, the Colonel's bellowed orders. Miss Marple reached the study to find chaos. Flames licked at the curtains, fed by a pile of papers in the grate. Colonel Hargrove was beating at the fire with a rug, while Rupert hauled a bucket of water from the hall. Clara stood frozen, her eyes wide, as Eleanor shouted, "Quickly, before it spreads!" Miss Marple's gaze swept the room, noting the open window, the scattered papers, and a faint trail of ash leading to the desk. "Careful, Colonel," she called, her voice calm but firm. "We must preserve what we can." With Rupert's water and Hargrove's efforts, the fire was subdued, leaving a charred mess and a lingering haze. Eleanor sank into a chair, her face ashen. "This was no accident," she said. "Someone set this deliberately." Finch appeared in the doorway, his coat dusted with soot, his notebook clutched tightly. "I heard the commotion from the library," he said, his eyes scanning. "The wreckage. Another letter, I presume." Miss Marple knelt by the grate, her fingers sifting through the ashes. Among the debris was a partially burned sheet, its edges curled but a few lines intact. She read aloud, her voice steady. The vow was sealed with Theodore's blood. Below it a single word stood out. Reginald, Reginald, Eleanor whispered, her voice trembling. My grandfather, Theodore's father. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. This confirms it, Eleanor. The vow is tied to Theodore's disappearance and the murder in the stables. But why burn this now? Rupert snorted, wiping soot from his hands. Because someone's scared. They know you're getting close, Miss Marple. Or they want us to think so, Finch said, his tone speculative. This feels like a performance, a distraction. Colonel Hargrove coughed, his face red from exertion. Distraction or not, this is madness. We should lock the house down, search every room. Miss Marple rose, the new fragment in her hand. A search may be premature, Colonel, but I agree. This fire was meant to destroy evidence, or to point us toward it. She turned to Clara, who was still trembling. Clara, dear, did you see anyone near the study tonight? Clara shook her head, her voice barely audible. No, miss. I was in the kitchen, but I smelled that perfume again, like last night. Sweet, like roses. Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloguing the detail. Roses. Not Eleanor's lavender, nor the men's tobacco. A new player, perhaps, or a clue misread. She glanced at the desk, where a letter opener lay askew, its handle smudged with ash. Mr. Finch, she said, you were in the library. Did you hear anything before the fire? Finch shrugged, but his eyes flickered. Just the wind. This old place creaks like a ship. Miss Marple's smile was faint. Indeed, but ships have captains, and this fire had a purpose. As the group dispersed to air out the smoke, Miss Marple lingered, piecing together the Dahib-de-Dieu fragments in her mind. The letters were forming a message, a vow sealed with Theodore's blood, tied to the Star of Ashwood, and a betrayal by the heir. Reginald's name was a breakthrough, suggesting the vow originated with him, not Theodore. But the fires were too frequent, too staged. Someone was orchestrating this, and the rose-scented perfume was a thread she couldn't yet place. She returned to her room, locking the door, and spread the fragments again. Using a pencil, she sketched the words in order, filling gaps with educated guesses. The message was incomplete, but a pattern emerged. The vow was sealed with Theodore's blood. The heir betrayed the star. The blood of the vow will fall. Her breath caught. The vow wasn't just a promise. It was a curse, and someone believed it was still binding. She thought of the journal's clue. Where the starlight falls. The manor's conservatory had a glass dome, often bathed in starlight. It was a place to start. As she blew out her candle, a faint rustle came from the corridor. Miss Marple's hand paused on the candlestick. The fire had spoken, but the ashes were not done. Chapter 9. The Nephew's Motive. The morning after the study fire, Ashwood Manor felt like a house holding its breath. The acrid scent of smoke lingered in the halls, and the guests moved with the wariness of chess pieces awaiting a checkmate. Miss Marple sat in the conservatory, her knitting a quiet rhythm against the patter of rain on the glass dome above. The space was a jungle of ferns and orchids, its air heavy with the scent of earth and, faintly, roses. She had chosen this spot deliberately, suspecting the journal's clue, where the starlight falls, pointed to the conservatory's starlit dome, but her attention was on Rupert Ashwood, who slouched in a wicker chair nearby, his cigarette smoke curling upward like a question mark. His careless charm had frayed, replaced by a restless energy that Miss Marple recognised from her village, the look of a man in debt. "Mr. Ashwood," she said, her voice as mild as a summer breeze. "You've been awfully quiet since the fire. I wonder if something's troubling you. The Star of Ashwood, perhaps." Rupert's cigarette paused halfway to his lips. "You're barking up the wrong tree, Miss Marple," he said, but his smirk was brittle. "I'm not the one setting fires." "No," she agreed, her needles clicking. "But you are interested in the brooch. A valuable heirloom could solve many problems, couldn't it? Debts, for instance." Rupert's eyes narrowed, and he leaned forward, his voice low. "What do you know about my debts?" Miss Marple's smile was serene. "Only what a village gossip might notice. The way you linger over the manor's treasures, the telegrams you send in haste, the way your hands shake when money is mentioned. In St. Mary Mead, such signs often point to a creditor breathing down one's neck." Rupert stubbed out his cigarette, his jaw tight. "All right, you're clever. Yes, I owe money. Gambling, bad investments, pick your poison. But I'm not burning letters or chasing cursed brooches. I just want what's mine." "And what's that?" Miss Marple asked, her gaze steady. "The estate," he snapped. "Aunt Eleanor's sitting on a fortune, and I'm the heir. If I could sell off a few trinkets, like that brooch, I'd be set." Before Miss Marple could press further, Felix, Finch strode in, his notebook ever present. "Trouble in paradise, Ashwood," he said, his tone mocking. "Or are you just confessing to Miss Marple?" Rupert shot to his feet. "Watch it, Finch. I know your game. You're not here for a book. You're sniffing out blackmail material. I saw you poking around my room yesterday." Finch's grin didn't waver. "Poking around? I was looking for a pen. But if I were blackmailing you, I'd have better dirt than your card debts." "Enough!" Eleanor's voice cut through, as she entered, her face pale but resolute. "Rupert, is this true? You're in debt?" Rupert's defiance crumbled. "It's not what you think, Aunt Eleanor. I just need a little help, that's all." Eleanor's eyes flashed. "Help? By selling the Star of Ashwood? That brooch is our legacy, not your piggy bank." Miss Marple cleared her throat, her voice gentle but firm. "Lady Eleanor, Mr. Ashwood's motives are clear, but they don't explain the fires. Someone else is orchestrating this, using the vow to stir fear, or to hide a greater crime." She turned to Finch. "Mr. Finch, you accused Rupert of hiding something. Care to share what you found?" Finch hesitated, then shrugged. "All right. I didn't want to say until I was sure, but I found a letter in the attic, not burned for once. It's from Theodore to his father Reginald, dated the night he disappeared. Says he's leaving to protect the vow, and that the brooch must stay hidden," Eleanor gasped. "Where is it now?" Finch's smile was sly. "Safe. I'll show it to you, Miss Marple, but I want credit for the find." Miss Marple nodded, but her mind was elsewhere. Rupert's debts made him desperate, but not cunning enough to stage the fires. Finch's convenient discoveries were piling up, and the rose-scented perfume still lingered, unplaced. She glanced at the glass dome, where rain streaked like tears. The starlight would fall here at night, and with it, perhaps, the brooch. The group dispersed. Miss Marple lingered, her eyes scanning the conservatory. A faint glint caught her attention near a potted orchid. A tiny sapphire chip, no bigger than a bead, half buried in the soil. She slipped it into her handkerchief, her pulse quickening. The star of Ashwood was close, and so was the truth. In the distance, a door slammed, and the faint scent of smoke drifted through the air. Miss Marple tightened her shawl. The game was nearing its end, and the next move would be decisive. Chapter 10. The Truth in the Ashes. The drawing-room of Ashwood Manor was a stage set for revelation, its heavy curtains drawn against the evening's chill. The fire burned low, casting flickering shadows across the faces of the gathered suspects. Lady Eleanor, regal but tense. Rupert, sullen and fidgeting. Colonel Hargrove, his moustache bristling with unease. Felix Finch, his notebook poised like a weapon. And Clara, hovering near the door, her eyes wide with apprehension. Miss Marple stood by the mantel, her knitting bag at her feet, her demeanour as calm as a village vicar's, but her eyes sharp as a hawk's. "I've asked you all here," she began, her voice clear and steady, "because the ashes of this house have been speaking, and it's time we listened. The charred letters, the fires, the whispers of a vow, they all point to a truth buried for 50 years, but no longer." Eleanor clasped her hands. "Jane, have you found the Star of Ashwood?" "Not yet," Miss Marple said, "but I've found something better, the story it guards." She reached into her bag, producing the fragments of the burned letters, carefully arranged on a sheet of paper. "These scraps, painstakingly collected, form a message. Let me read it to you." She adjusted her spectacles and began. "The vow was sealed with Theodore's blood. The air betrayed the star. The blood of the vow will fall where the starlight falls." The room was silent, save for the crackle of the fire. Rupert shifted uncomfortably. "Sounds like gibberish to me." "Far from it," Miss Marple said. "The vow was a pact made by Theodore Ashwood and another, sealed with his blood, likely a symbolic act, but one that carried weight. The heir refers to Theodore, who betrayed the vow by planning to flee with the Star of Ashwood, the brooch that symbolized it. The starlight points to the conservatory, where I found a sapphire chip this morning." Finch leaned forward, his eyes gleaming. "So, the brooch is there, and the vow. What was it?" Miss Marple's gaze swept the room. The vow was a promise to protect a secret, one tied to the murder of the valet in 1875. Theodore's journal and the unburned letter. Mr. Finch found confirm he was leaving to escape that secret. But someone stopped him, permanently. Colonel Hargrove's face reddened. "Are you suggesting Theodore was murdered?" "I am," Miss Marple said calmly. "And the burned letters are a warning, or a confession, from someone who knows the truth. Someone in this room." Clara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Eleanor's voice was sharp. "Jane, who?" Miss Marple held up a hand. "Let's consider the clues. The fires were deliberate, meant to destroy or reveal the letters. The rose-scented perfume mentioned by Clara is not Lady Eleanor's lavender. The voice Clara heard, posher than Rupert's or the Colonel's, suggests an outsider, and the journal, conveniently found by Mr. Finch, raises questions about its timing." Finch's grin faltered. You think I'm behind this? I'm just a writer, Miss Marple. A writer with ash on his cuffs and a knack for finding clues, she replied. But you're not alone in suspicion. Mr. Ashwood's debts make him desperate for the brooch, and his presence near the fires is no coincidence. Colonel Hargrove's vow to protect the family's honour could hide a darker loyalty. And Clara, dear, your fear suggests you know more than you've said. Clara shook her head, tears welling. I don't, miss, I swear. Miss Marple's tone softened. I believe you, Clara. But someone here is orchestrating this, and I believe it's tied to Reginald Ashwood himself. The letter mentioning his name suggests he was the vow's architect, and his portrait in the hall has been watching us all. Rupert snorted. A painting! Now you're reaching. Am I? Miss Marple said. The portrait's frame is heavy, perfect for hiding something. I checked it this afternoon and found a faint outline of a compartment. I suspect the Star of Ashwood is there, along with the final piece of the vow. Eleanor rose, her face pale. Then we must look at once. Miss Marple nodded, but her eyes were on the group, watching for a telltale flinch. We will. But first I must ask, who among you has been burning these letters? And why now? After 50 years. The fire crackled, and a log shifted, sending a shower of sparks into the air. Finch's pen stilled. Hargrove's hands clenched. Rupert's smirk faded, and then a soft creak came from the hall, as if the house itself was answering. Miss Marple's smile was faint. The truth is close, she said, but the ashes have one more secret to tell. Chapter 11. The Final Twist. The air in Ashwood Manor's drawing-room was thick with tension, the fire's glow casting long shadows that seemed to dance with the secrets of the past. Miss Marple stood by the mantel, her hands clasped, her eyes moving from face to face as the suspects awaited her next words. The charred letter's message. The vow was sealed with Theodore's blood. The air betrayed the star. The blood of the vow will fall, where the starlight falls, hung over them like a curse. The creak from the hall lingered in the silence, a reminder that the house was not done speaking. Miss Marple turned to the group, her voice calm but commanding. The Star of Ashwood is hidden in the portrait of Reginald Ashwood. I'm certain of it. But before we retrieve it, we must unmask the one who has been burning these letters, and why. The vow is not just a pact. It's a chain, binding the guilty to the past. She stepped toward the door, motioning for the others to follow. Come, let's examine the portrait. The hall was dimly lit, the portrait of Reginald Ashwood looming above the staircase, his stern eyes seeming to follow them. Miss Marple ran her fingers along the frame, feeling for the compartment she'd suspected. A faint click sounded, and a small panel slid open, revealing a velvet pouch. Inside was the Star of Ashwood, a sapphire brooch, its facets catching, the lamplight like a trapped constellation. Tucked beside it was a final, unburned letter, its wax seal broken. Eleanor gasped. The brooch! And another letter! Miss Marple unfolded the paper, her voice steady as she read, To my son, Theodore, I confess my sin. The vow was mine, a pact with the valet to secure our fortune through deceit. When he threatened to expose us, I struck him down. The star seals our shame. Hide it or destroy it, but never let it fall. It was signed, Reginald Ashwood. The group stood frozen. Colonel Hargrove's face was ashen. Reginald? A murderer? Yes, Miss Marple said. Reginald killed the valet to protect the vow. A scheme to defraud creditors, I suspect, using the brooch as collateral. Theodore, horrified, planned to flee with the brooch to end the deceit. But he never made it. Someone ensured he didn't. Rupert's voice was hoarse. You're saying Theodore was killed too? Miss Marple nodded. And the burned letters were a warning or a confession meant to expose the truth. But the question is, who knew? And who has been stoking these fires? Joe turned to Finch, whose grin had vanished. Mr. Finch, your discoveries, the journal, the attic letter, were too convenient. You've been guiding us to this moment, haven't you? Not for a book, but for something personal. Finch's eyes darted to the door, but he forced a laugh. You're clever, Miss Marple, but I'm no mastermind. I'm just a journalist. Then why? Miss Marple said, producing a small vial from her bag. Does this rose-scented perfume found in your room this morning match Clara's description of the figure by the fire? The room erupted. Rupert lunged at Finch, but Hargrove held him back. Clara whimpered and Eleanor's voice cut through. Jane, is this true? Before Miss Marple could answer, a new voice spoke from the shadows of the hall. A woman's voice, low and commanding. Enough, Jane. You've done well, but it's time to end this. Lady Eleanor stepped forward, but her posture was different, her eyes blazing with a fire Miss Marple hadn't seen before. The group turned, stunned, as she continued. Felix is my pawn, not the mastermind. I orchestrated the letters, the fires, all of it. Miss Marple's smile was faint. I thought as much, Eleanor. The lavender you wear is a mask, but the rose perfume betrayed you. You've been pulling the strings, using Finch to plant clues, and Rupert's greed to distract us. But why? Eleanor's laugh was bitter, because I knew the truth about my grandfather's crime. I found his confession years ago, hidden in the portrait. I swore to protect the family's honour, but when Rupert started digging for the brooch and Finch began prying, I had to act. The burned letters were meant to scare them off or to force the truth into the open so I could control it. Hargrove's voice trembled. Eleanor, you burned the letters? Yes, she said, her chin high, and I ensured Theodore's fate remained buried. He wasn't killed, Jane. He fled, but I spread the rumour of his murder to keep the vow's secret safe. The valet's death was enough scandal. Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her voice was firm. You went too far, Eleanor. The fires endangered lives, and your deception hurt those you claimed to protect. The vow is broken now, and the truth is free. Eleanor's shoulders sagged, the fight draining from her. Then do what you must, Jane. Miss Marple shook her head. The police will decide, but I suspect they'll find Theodore's flight mitigates the crime. The brooch, however, belongs to the family, not to greed or shame. She handed the Star of Ashwood to Rupert, who stared at it, speechless. Finch slipped away, his notebook forgotten, and Clara wept quietly. Hargrove muttered something about honour, his face a mask of disillusionment. As the group dispersed, Miss Marple lingered by the portrait, her fingers brushing the frame. The ashes had spoken, and the vow was undone, but the cost of secrets she knew would linger in Ashwood's halls. Chapter 12. Resolution at Ashwood. The morning sun broke through the clouds over Ashwood Manor, its golden light softening the grim stone towers and banishing the shadows that had clung to the house for days. Miss Marple stood in the conservatory, her knitting bag packed, her sensible hat adjusted for the journey back to St. Mary Mead. The star of Ashwood, now safely locked in Eleanor's safe, gleamed in her memory, a sheer symbol not of a curse, but of a family's reckoning. The drawing-room was quiet as the group gathered one last time. Lady Eleanor sat by the window, her silver hair catching the light, her face weary but resolute. The police had come and gone, taking statements but no arrests. Eleanor's confession that she had orchestrated the fires and letters to protect the family's honour, and that Theodore had fled rather than been murdered, had softened the legal consequences. The valet's death, pinned on Reginald 50 years ago, was too distant for prosecution, and Theodore's survival, confirmed by an old letter Eleanor produced, closed the case. Rupert stood by the fireplace, the star of Ashwood's fate, now a family decision. "I'm not selling it," he said, his voice subdued. "Not after all this. I'll find another way to clear my debts." Miss Marple nodded, her smile warm. "A wise choice, Mr. Ashwood. Greed burns hotter than any fire, but it leaves only ash." Colonel Hargrove, his moustache less bristling, cleared his throat. "I owe you an apology, Miss Marple. I thought you were meddling, but you've saved this family from itself." "Nonsense, Colonel," she said gently. "I only listened to what the ashes were saying. In my village, you see, secrets are like weeds. They grow until someone pulls them out." Felix Finch had left at dawn, his notebook empty of the scandal he'd hoped to write. Miss Marple suspected he'd find another story, but his role as Eleanor's unwitting pawn had humbled him. Clara, no longer trembling, brought tea, her eyes brighter. "Thank you, miss," she whispered. "I ain't scared no more." Miss Marple patted her hand. "You were braver than you knew, Clara. Keep that courage." Eleanor rose, crossing to Miss Marple. "Jane, I don't know how to thank you. I thought I was protecting the family, but I was only hiding from the truth. You've given us a chance to start anew." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "The truth is a stern friend, Eleanor, but a loyal one. Keep the star of Ashwood, not as a secret, but as a reminder. Honour is earned, not buried." As she stepped into the hall, Miss Marple paused by Reginald's portrait, now stripped of its hidden compartment. The old patriarch's eyes seemed less stern, as if relieved of their burden. She smiled faintly, thinking of the charred letters, the rose-scented perfume, and the vow that had bound a family to its past. Human nature, she mused, was the real puzzle. Greed, loyalty, fear, and redemption, all woven into the same tapestry. The taxi waited outside, its engine humming. Miss Marple climbed in, her knitting bag at her side, her mind already drifting to the quiet of St. Mary Mead. But as the manor faded into the mist, she glanced back, catching a glimmer of light from the conservatory's dome, where the starlight fell, and the truth had finally risen. "Drive on," she said to the driver, her voice soft but content. The ashes had spoken, and Ashwood Manor was at peace. For now, that was enough.